In this video, we're going to look at how we can use GroupBy to aggregate data in data frames. And in the follow-up video, we'll do some examples and have you practice a bunch of different use cases. All right, so why do we even want to do this? In general, it's usually useful to be able to group together rows that fall under the same category. For example, in our baby names data set that we've been working with, we may want to group together all the rows from the same year. And then we may be interested, for example, in counting the number of babies born in a given year, in which case I want to aggregate across all rows in that category. This is useful for performing large operations at once and summarizing trends in your data set. And we'll see how Pandas has a nice built-in functionality that we can do this without for loops. So let's continue with our baby names data frame that we've been playing with. I'm going to pop over to the data here. It's the same Pandas part 2, and let's just loading the Colorado data set. And then scroll down to this part of this notebook where we start with grouping. And as I am going through the examples in the slides, I recommend you actually play with it here live in your notebook. I'm going to point out, just to make this a little bit easier to see what's going on underneath the hood, I'm going to create a temporary smaller data frame that just consists of these 6 rows, so that we can get a little bit of a better sense of what's happening without working with the full data set. Okay, so let's go back to the slides with these. So when I take a data frame and call .groupby, this is going to end up splitting up my original data frame based on how I choose to group. So if I say group by year, this is going to choose all of the items that are in the same year and put them into a new sub-data frame. And so what you get here are a sub-data frame with the year 1910, a sub-data frame with the year 2008, and a sub-data frame with the year 2015. Calling this is generating these data frame group by objects, but in reality, we don't get to see them. So if you try just calling baby names temp.group by year, it's just going to tell you have a data frame group by object. It won't give you visibility into it. In order to actually get an output, we have to choose some way to aggregate each of these sub data frames. So on the next slide, here we've got baby names.group by year. And now if I aggregate, in this case, I can aggregate by summing the count column. There's 2 different coding forms we could use for this. One of them is to use the .ag and then create a dictionary and say exactly how I want to aggregate this given column. And this methodology is going to be really helpful if I want to start, say, aggregating different columns using different functions, or aggregating the same column with multiple functions. We'll be using this dictionary format. You could also, by shorthand, just select the count column from each subdata frame and then call .agsum. And I will point out it'll work if you do .agsum and or if you put quotes here. Both of those are going to work. We'll see why in a minute. And that's going to lead you to saying, all right, I'm going to add up the total here, and that's what's going to come here, add up the total. Okay. Notice when you do a group by, it's going to re-index the output of your data frame. So my original index here were just these integer values. My new index is going to become the year values, and by default, it's going to get sorted in ascending order. So one point to be careful of here is in these cases, I was very specific that the only thing I was summing was the count column, because I either specified that here or I selected the count column before I aggregated. If I hadn't done that, if I had just done .groupByYear, .agsum, or with the quotes, either one's going to work, it's then going to try to aggregate every column. And so the way that it interprets sum for strings is just to concatenate them. And that's what you see is happening. And so that's not really useful output, which is why typically we're going to do this type of thing where I select exactly what column I want to aggregate. One other caveat about this is if you choose an aggregation function that won't work on all data types, for example, mean is a great example. If I try to do .ag mean, I'm going to get a type error output because it's going to tell me I can't calculate the mean of strings. So this is, again, just another warning and a good reason to be really specific with which columns you want to grab before you do the aggregation. All right, so I'd hinted at this before. What goes inside of .ag? There's some built-in functions, which we're going to go through. And then you can also define your own function, which we're going to practice with in the next video when we do examples. In terms of commonly used built-in ones, you can sum using any of these three calls. So that's why I was hinting at the fact that the quotes are going to work as well. You can find the max of each column in each group, again, using these calls. Similarly, you can do the min and the mean, which we talked about. And then there's some pandas specific built-in functions, and we'll practice with these. One of them is first and its corresponding counterpart last, which is basically going to give you the first entry in each group for each column. So we'll look at that in a minute. Count is going to return the counts of all your non-null values in each column of each group. And its similar related call is size, which is going to return the number of rows in each group, which will include missing values. I know this is a lot to take in. This is a good reference page to go to. In the next few slides, we're going to do examples, and I highly recommend that you play with this as we go through, just so you can start to get used to these. Just to add to the choice of code that you may or may not want to use, yes, Pandas has some shorthand built-in functions. Any of these here on this Pandas column, you can actually call directly without using .ag. So you can just do .mean or .sum or .first or .count, and that will work as well. All right, let's try some practice. So suppose this is my original data frame. I call a GroupBy on this original data frame, and I'm grouping by the alph column, and then I'm aggregating using max. So here I haven't specified which columns to aggregate. I'm just saying aggregate all of them using max. So take a minute and see if you could predict what's going to go in the question marks here. All right, let's look at the number column first. So for each subdata frame, it's going to give me the max in each of those. So I'm going to get those values. Then separately, it's going to look at the ST, short for the state column, and it's going to give us the max. Now in terms of strings, max is defined as later in the alphabet. So it's going to give me this one, and this one. So notice when you get these, when you aggregate multiple columns, you aren't necessarily going to be grabbing all the same data from the same row. It's just looking at within each data frame and aggregating each column independently. Let's look at how count works. So here I made up a data frame that had some null values just so you can see the difference between count and size in this case. Here I'm grouping by year. And so now if I do .count, this is going to return a data frame with the counts of the non-missing values in each column. So for this first subdata frame, I only have one non-missing value for this column num, whereas I have two. So I'd expect a 1 here and 2 here. Both of these, I would get 2, 2, because I don't have any missing. Here, I'm going to get 4, 3. So that's a useful way to peek in and also just count your non-null. Size, on the other hand, is just going to be returning the number of rows in each group. So that's going to return a series. And yes, you could also get this information using a value counts call. And really the only difference is basically how they're sorted. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this idea of first. Let me show you how this is going to work. So if we go back to our baby names temp and I group by year, then I call first, it's now going to look at the first entry in each of these sub data frames, and that's what it's going to grab. So that was really dependent on how this original data frame was sorted, right? Because that's really the order that indicated how they were pulled. When I went to 1910, it pulled that one first and then this one second, just because that's how they were sorted in my original data frame. So if I sort my data frame first, so you'll see what's going to happen here. Let's say I sort by count and then I group by. Now notice the first entry, so let's look just at 1910 again. Once I've sorted by count, this is actually going to become the first entry because it's going to sort default ascending, and this will be the second. And so when I go pull out dot first, it's actually just going to give me this row. And similarly, I'm going to see the same thing. So it's helpful, this idea of first versus last, but it very much depends on how your original data frame is sorted before you do the group by. Now we can get a little fancier in case we want to aggregate, for example, using multiple aggregation functions. So if for some reason I'm interested not just in the max or the sum, but I want multiple statistics, I can call all of those inside the dictionary by just putting them in a list. Similarly, I can aggregate different columns using different functions. So if I want the max in each sub-data frame, I want the max count and the min name, that's what's going to come out here. Now, I will just give you the caveat that anytime you're doing this group by, the column name corresponds to whatever column you're actually aggregating. It doesn't give you any insight into how you've aggregated. And so it's good practice to rename these columns right afterwards so that the data frame that you're working with gives you some insight into how you've actually aggregated. Now, we can also group by multiple columns, which can become useful. For example, if I wanted to find the total number of babies born of each sex in each year, I can now group by year and sex first, which is, and then call whatever I'd like to aggregate. So if I group by year and sex, I'm now going to get what's called a multi-indexed data frame because I now have multiple dimensions. This is great. You can definitely work with it like this. If you want to flatten it back to a normal data frame, you can do .reset index and it'll keep all of the same information. It's just going to reset it so that your index is back to these integer values, which sometimes is easier to work with. And finally, the last thing we can do with the group by functionality is actually a process called filtering. So in this case, you're going to group on some column, and then you're going to call .filter instead of .ag. Filter is going to take an argument function, and this function is very specific. It has to take a data frame as your input, and it has to return a Boolean output. So let me give you an example. I will put the I'll explain the caveat that this is going to apply the function to each sub-data frame. And then if you get a true for a group, all rows belonging to that group are preserved. So this is kind of a fancier idea of a Boolean mask that we were working with when we were doing conditional selection. It's fancier in the sense that it's not doing it row by row. It's doing it per group. And it also doesn't give you a new index. So it's basically just going to return exactly your original data frame, but filtering out any of the sub-data frames that don't return a true from your function. So that's a lot to take in. Let's try it with an actual example. Here, I'm grouping by year. And now I'm going to create a function. And here, just to write it shorter, I did it using a lambda function, but you could also define this separately outside of this call if you prefer. This is saying, okay, it's taking a data frame, I'm calling the data frame SF. What is it going to do with that data frame? It's going to select the column count, it's going to sum the column, and then it's going to test whether or not the sum of that column is greater than 15. So I just made it up, right? So I can see here, yes, I have more than 15 babies that were born in this 1910 subdata frame. Again, this is my little baby names temp, so this was just the sub one we're playing with, or the temporary one. Here, I'm not exceeding my 15, and so I'm not going to get those rows at all. Here, because the sum of this did meet my criteria, it's going to be included. And if you're thinking, wait, where was the order? Why is it that way? It's because we're really keeping the exact same data frame we started with. It's just we're deciding what we're going to filter out. So it might be easier to think of the fact that we're filtering out these two rows because their sub data frame didn't hit the criteria, and we're going to keep the rest. Again, because this one hit the criteria. So here's what you're returned with, and yes, the output is a data frame with your original index. So that's a quick overview of the GroupBy functionality, and in the next video we'll put this into practice.